Thanks, Dan. I have that coveted after lunch spot. Yeah, this is the one. This is the one that is the most important talk, right? Because I have to try to keep you awake. So I will be watching, and we're not going to turn on the lights, no? Keep the lights up, yeah? Probably about 30 minutes we'll have a stand-up, sit-down, just make sure the... Well, the only thing worse than talking about weeds is trying to get people to do calisthenics after lunch. So I don't think I'll do that either. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about weed management. Now, this is a tough thing to do because in a room like this, you never know where people are as far as their knowledge about it. We got probably some beginners. We got some people who've been at this for 40 years. Could probably teach this to me. So what I've got in mind is to kind of talk a little basics, kind of cover a little the ideas that I think maybe you haven't heard or haven't heard for a while, and hopefully we'll get some information that maybe you hadn't thought about before. So that's the idea. So we're going to start basic life cycle of weeds, right? Annuals? Okay, weeds, annuals. How long does it take an annual to go from seed to seed? Anybody? 1 year? Did I hear that? 1 year. Yes, that's correct. Less than 12 months. We got winter annuals, summer annuals. We talk about all these. The biennials. How long does it take the biennial to go from seed to seed? 2 years. Oh, gosh, this is great. Perennials. Two kinds of perennials. Simple perennials. Creeping perennials. How long does a perennial live? Forever. Yeah, like anybody can know that. They live a long time, okay? We'll talk about some of these. So let's talk about the winter annuals first. So winter annuals germinate in the fall. Yeah, I know, I'm pulling a fast one on you. Fall is when these seeds germinate. You have to start looking for them in the fall. These are some common ones. If you look at where I live in the coastal side of Washington, and you see a weed out there, 9 times out of 10 it's a winter annual. So we have to deal a lot with winter annuals. Here, I understand you get cold, right? Yeah? Get snow from time to time. Yeah, we don't typically get that where I'm at. Now, the Lens here, they can tell you they get snow, because they're up in Okanagan, they get all kinds of stuff there. But we don't. So we get weeds that germinate in the fall, grow all winter long, and these are the guys that we get. Summer annuals will start to germinate when? Springtime. Yes, you see these springtime guys. These are the ones that you probably are going to have to deal with the most, particularly in vegetable production, also somewhat in berries and maybe some other the fruit crops. Look for these in warmer climates, warmer than what I get. We don't get, in fact, some of these just don't do very well where we are. However, in the central part of the state, eastern Washington, you bet, we get a lot of these. Biennials. These are the common ones. You usually aren't going to see many biennials show up in annual cultivated areas. If you're doing any cultivation at all, you're usually getting rid of those first-year seedlings. These things just don't stand out very, very long. A couple of these may be a little bit different, particularly bull thistle, because it does blow in, and so you can see that thing move in sometime in the annual production. The simple perennials, if you got a perennial crop, guess what you've got? Perennial weeds, yeah? You got some of these? This is our state flower here, this one right there. You see that? Scotch broom? Yeah. It's all over the place for us. We got a lot of dandelion, broadleaf dock, plantains, things like that. But these also reproduce by seeds. They don't spread except by seeds. So everything we've talked about so far, winter annual, summer annual, biennial, simple perennials, you've got to aim at the seeds. Seeds are a critical thing here. Creeping perennials, gosh, what can I say? This is the one that's the problem for any kind of production. A lot of these don't like cultivation, but a lot of them say, thank you very much for cultivating us, because we move it around and keep things fresh and happy and alive and alert. So these are the tougher ones to deal with. If you don't have these, my answer is don't get them, because these are bad ones. These are bad ones, and anything you do, especially in organic production, you just don't have the tools to deal with these. We don't have the stuff to deal with in commercial production and standard production. You know, they're hard to get rid of. So if you have them, get rid of them early, get rid of them often. Okay, it's important to know the weeds that you're dealing with. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I don't talk about buying weed because, you know, I don't figure it's really a big issue for people. Yeah, I'm sorry if I left anybody's favorite weed off of there. We've got a little bindweed as well, so yes, you're in good company, ma'am. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, know your enemies. This is 2 weeks. Now, we've got this Weeds of the West book. I saw it for sale out here, so you can go out and get that. I will tell you that when the weed scientists put this one together, they went out there and quizzed all the weed scientists and said, what are your worst weeds? And this is all the western states. So we're going to have stuff in there from Hawaii, which I know are a big problem weeds here. The big problem up in my part of the state of Washington probably would not set foot in Utah because it's too hot down here. Things like that. So not every weed that you're going to see in there is a problem necessarily where you live. But for the most part, most of the common weeds are in there. So if you don't know what you're dealing with, find out. I got this other book up there, The Aquatic and Riparian Weeds of the West. It's got a lot of good photos in there, and sometimes what we see on stream banks will also be things we see in irrigated agriculture. So it's not a bad book to look at. It's got great photos in it and can help you identify some of those plants. Now, I did see a small little booklet, too. It's put together by Utah State folks. $5, come on, it's great. You got a good ID book there. I use the internet a lot, frankly, but it's very important for you to get an answer as to what the weeds are you're dealing with, because all the things we're going to talk about are based on that life cycle for the most part, particularly in organic production, but also in conventional agriculture. You need to know what you're dealing with in order to try to control it. So that's an important thing. If you don't know what you have, bring it into your local extension office. If they don't know what it is, they can get an answer for you, hopefully within a few days. That's the answer to setting up a weed control program. So I'm going to talk about this kind of stuff here for the next little bit. I want to talk a little bit about seed germination, because how many of those life cycles weeds have seed issues? All the annuals, all the biennials, simple perennials. You've got to be able to control the seeds. I want to visit crop competition, weed life cycles to an extent, somewhat on taxonomy. And by then, I'm sure Dan will be holding up the sign saying you've got 2 minutes left. This will be online, you said, right? So you'll have available to this. Or I'll send it to Jennifer. You can write her. So there'll be amendments, contact herbicides, and cover crops. But Lori already talked about cover crops, so I don't need to go there. Let's talk about annual weeds. How do seeds know when to germinate? The weeds are not particularly bright in the brain side of things. There are no brains in there, but they seem to get along pretty well, don't they? Think about what it is about the weeds that makes them difficult. First of all, weeds make a lot of seed. Would you agree with that? Yeah, they sure do. So even if you're doing a very good job of weed control, consider 1 square foot of ground, you got 100 weed seeds there. If I get 99% weed control, 99, and that's good, isn't it? 99%, I'd take that. So you only have 1 seedling left in that square foot. Well, that is enough to replenish a seed bank in 1 season if you don't control that particular plant. So it becomes very much a real important thing to not let those things go to seed if you possibly can help it. So that's the first critical thing. Keep in mind, too, that at least in vegetable production, usually the first thing up is not the plant that you planted, is it? No, it's a weed, because the weed is there. The seed is present, already imbibed, ready to go. It just needs the conditions right for it to germinate and do its thing. Keep in mind, too, that if you're using tillage, and everybody uses tillage, yes? Almost everybody, I suppose. Tillage, every time you till, you're bringing up seed from deep in the soil. So as deep as you till, you're going to bring up seed from there. Some of that seed, if it's been in a pasture or something like that, may have been buried, the first Johnson administration, way back when. So it's old stuff down there, but a lot of times they are still very viable and still quite capable of doing it. So keep in mind that when you do cultivate, shallow cultivations may be a better way to go if you're using some of the principles we're going to visit with you about. Our whole idea, though, is we're never going to beat weeds completely. I think we'll always have weeds, and we'll always have to deal with them every year. But we can do some things managerially to kind of shift that balance of power away from the weeds and more to our crop plants. So let's talk about seed germination. Now, seeds typically are going to respond to light. Even though we're putting them in the soil, there is a bit of light that gets down, particularly into the shallow little niches of this soil. So phytochrome is present in seed coat of just about every weed seed that's out there. And phytochrome is it's kind of like an antenna that takes in light, or teeny little bit of light. It doesn't have to be a lot of light, just a small amount of light. If it's red light, visible type red light, that activates the phytochrome. And phytochrome says to that plant, okay, this seed now is ready to germinate. The phytochrome is kind of the mediating process that allows that to occur. If it gets far red illumination, and far red is not visible light, it's almost to the infrared kind of thing. So it's almost more of a heat type of response. So when that seed gets exposed to that far red light, that inactivates phytochrome. Phytochrome says, don't germinate. And the seed doesn't. That's when the seed becomes essentially facultatively dormant. It just kind of is sitting there waiting for conditions to get right. So red light, visible light, tells the seed to germinate. Far red says, don't germinate. Now, think about where that seed is on the ground. Now, if it's on the surface of the soil, maybe it just blew in last year, like a dandelion seed or something like that, or maybe you tilled up and brought some seed up to the surface, it's going to get exposed to red light. Right? It's close enough to the surface, it's going to get that exposure, activates the phytochrome, and then that seed could germinate because the phytochrome is allowing it to do that. A buried seed, something that's down there maybe an inch or 2 inches or 3 inches, will not germinate because it doesn't get that phytochrome activation. So keep those seeds buried and you don't have to worry about it. It's kind of a nice little thing for the seed, because the seed, if it's only a millimeter wide, it can only send up a shoot maybe an inch, maybe a little more than an inch, but not much. So if that seed is that deep and it tries to germinate and grow, well, that's not going to be a weed we're going to have to worry about, is it? Because it's not going to make it to the surface, it's not going to reproduce, and it's not going to do its thing. Keep in mind the winter annuals. We said they germinate in the fall, right? Winter annuals germinate. Typically, they're taking in not only the quality of the light, but the duration of the light. The day-to-day light. They're looking for the shortening days in the fall, and that's going to be the indication for the winter annual that it's time to germinate. Summer annuals, conversely, it's the other way around. They're looking for increasing day length, kind of like we have right now. Especially a lot of species after they've had a certain temperature exposure. So these types of annuals will germinate more in the springtime because they're responding again to that lengthening daylight. The temperature part does play a good role. There are certain temperature maximums and minimums and optimums for most weed seeds to do their thing. So depending on species, they're going to have different optima. Those winter annuals, again, they like cooler soil temperatures, and they typically germinate in those cool temperatures. Summer annuals, just kind of the opposite. They like that warming temperature, not really hot temperatures, but they do want warmer temperatures than what the winter annuals do. And again, it kind of follows the cold treatment of the wintertime, kind of sets some of these seeds to germinate once the days get to a certain length and once the temperatures get to a certain level. Weed seeds have to be imbibed. Usually that's not a big problem unless you're living physically in a desert that hasn't had rain for a while, but most seeds in the soil are imbibed, and they can vernalize and do all their things as an imbibed seed. Keep in mind, though, that many weed seeds will not germinate initially. Sometimes it takes 2 to 3 to 4 years before that seed is ready to germinate. I pointed out that Scotch broom. If we have Scotch broom present, first of all, it's very hard seed coats, like alfalfa, it's like clover, other legume plants. It's got a seed coat that is so tough that it doesn't allow oxygen to get into that embryo, and the embryo just kind of sits there in dormancy, waiting for the conditions to get right. If I take Scotch broom seed, try to germinate it, I maybe get 30 to 40% germination initially. If I take that same seed, put it in battery acid for 2 hours, I can get 95% germination. Battery, you gotta love that in a weed, don't you? Yeah. So it's just an indication, though, that weeds do have dormancy built in sometimes. Sometimes it's facultative. In other words, the conditions aren't right for it at that particular moment. Other times there is something inside, something that has to leach out from rainfall irrigation. Sometimes it's a seed coat issue. Sometimes it's something else. But there are dormancy built in a lot of these weeds. This is a trial. I just want to kind of give you a quick overview. This is a trial we were doing in peas. One of the observations we had is that peas are pretty competitive with weeds. So a lot of farmers would say, well, I don't really need to do weed control in my peas because the peas are going to do it for me, right? And to an extent, they're right. We thought we would take a look then, and let's look at reduced rate herbicides. Let's look at no herbicides and see what happens. First of all, we didn't see a difference in the yield. The pea yield was about the same across, regardless of whether we did weed control or not. Hey, great, right? We don't have to use anything to get rid of the weeds. Well, we went out into those plots, took 1 meter square, took the peas, took the weeds, and kind of ground it all up into a nice little mass of stuff. We put those into flats in the greenhouse, and then we tried to germinate what weeds were there, right? Make sense? So in the fall, we just took those flats, watered them up, put them in the greenhouse, and you can see here what, there it is, what the fall is. See how low those germinations are? That is an indication then that we're dealing with, at least in these plots, were predominantly summer annuals, right? They didn't have that cold temperature. They respond to lengthening days, not short days. So these fall weeds just did not do much in the germination. We then took those flats, put them outside, let them sit out there for a month or so, then brought them back in, and you can see what kind of germination we got. This is again from 1 square meter. 1 square meter, we were getting 8,000 weed seeds germinating. Let alone all that dormant stuff, right? So 8,000 seeds per square meter were germinating. And if you look here at the total, 95% of them were for summer annuals. So if we would have tried to control summer annuals, then we could have done a much better job of not having to deal with this stuff. Let's look at this at a numbers level. Now, this command plus Bascran, that was our full meal deal as far as herbicides. So we had very few weeds in there, good weed control. We ended up with 3 weeds per square meter. Well, if we extrapolate that to an acre, 12,000 weeds per acre. Now, but you can handle that, right? How many of you pick 12,000 weeds a year? You could do that in your sleep, right? That's no problem. So these other ones, these are reduced rates. This Syncor here, 469 weeds. It's not bad. That's only 1.9 million per acre. Now we're getting a little maybe beyond what you want to do in a year. The non-treated check, we did nothing. Remember, we didn't have any loss in the weeds. I mean, loss in the peas. Peas were same amount of peas produced. 8,000 weeds per square meter and 32.6 million per acre. Yeah, that's why weeds win. They're able to put out that much stuff, and even 1 year of not controlling them becomes a problem. So do you want to follow that? Probably not. What would you put into that particular piece of ground that would be able to compete with those kind of weeds? Maybe sometimes we need to think about that. Maybe sometimes we need to think about what we did last year, what weeds are doing last year, and then choose a crop that's going to compete with those. In the world of plants, the firstest with the mostest wins. And if it's a crop plant, that crop plant has an advantage over the weed. If it's a weed, the weed has an advantage over the crop plant. So you want to have anything that you can do to get a crop up fast and starting to compete quickly. Get that canopy closed up and everything's good. Densely growing crops compete generally better than less dense crops. You know this. You've seen this out in your fields. Solid seeded crops generally do better than row crops. Now, if you're using cultivation or something between rows or mulching or doing something like that, you're adding something more to it besides just the crop. But keep in mind, the crop is one of your best friends out there as far as competing with the weeds. So how do you improve that competition? Well, you got to have healthy plants, first of all. Lori was talking about all these things in the soil that helps you get healthy plants, and they will help compete with the weeds. And that's what we're really after. Closer planting in the row is sometimes a good thing to do if you know you're going to have a lot of weeds in that particular spot, particularly if it's a weed that you have kind of a hard time with. If you plant a little more densely, it's going to compete better. Closer row spacings is another thing you can do. That cuts down the amount of light getting to the soil surface, right? And light, what does light do? Tells those seeds to germinate. Anything we can do to cut the amount of light getting to the soil means less seed germination, means fewer weeds you're going to have to deal with. Crop transplants can help you with that. Well, I should mention with the high density stuff, planting closer in the row can be a good thing, but there are trade-offs, right? If you got a crop plant every inch, how much yield are you going to get off of that? Not as much. So you have to be within range of things. You have to keep that in mind too. Obviously, you can't do it with everything, but keep in mind that the more dense you plant, the better off you are as far as weeds are concerned. Transplants can help you out because, again, the firstest with the mostest wins. If that transplant is up and going faster than it would be if you planted it from seed, then you're in good shape, and you're probably going to compete better against the weeds than if you do it the other way around. Time the weed control efforts to get those weeds when they're really, really small. And I know you know this, and how hard it is to do, but it's really true. If you get a cotyledon sage weed, that's when you want to kill those guys because they really die easy. If they get up 3 leaves, 4 leaves, 5 leaves, 6 leaves, oh, geez, it just gets worse, and it gets worse more rapidly. So get them early, get them often, and that's the name of the game. Think about the life cycle. We talked about winter annual versus summer annual versus biennials. Weeds tend to do the same thing that the crop that they're growing with. And when you think about it, it makes sense. For instance, if you've got an overwintering crop, now maybe you guys don't have many of those around here, but we have a few. And so for those overwintering crops, we usually get the weeds that are of the life cycle similar to that. In other words, if we're planting cabbage that we're going to be growing through the winter, we get a lot of winter annual weeds in that cabbage. We're not able to cultivate in there. We're not able to control it quite as well. And so the life cycle that is favored is the same as the crop plant. If you're doing early spring crops, those hardy vegetables and things like that, you're also going to favor those, either the early summer annuals or perhaps even some winter annuals will germinate at the same time if you get out there really early. If you've got a crop of, say, pumpkins or some of these later germinating type of crop plant, you're going to favor the summer annuals. The winter annuals would have already germinated, but you're cultivating, you're getting the seed bed ready, you're getting rid of all those. So you're basically favoring, again, the same life cycle as what you're growing. Now we can use that against the weeds. We'll never get rid of all the weeds, keep in mind, but we want to keep the weeds off balance. We want to do something that the weeds aren't thinking that we know about them. And we know what is growing out there. You know your fields. You know what didn't work last year. You know what you expect to grow up there this year. If you've got a lot of winter annuals out there, start thinking, well, maybe I want to grow summer annual vegetable in that patch this year. Because, again, you'll get that extra cultivation in there. You'll get rid of those winter annual weeds. That'll be one more chance to get rid of those seeds. If you've got a lot of summer annual weeds there, think about maybe some of those early vegetables, maybe some of that lettuce out there. Maybe put in some carrots or something like that that can handle a little bit of frost. Because the summer annual weeds can't. They won't even germinate for another month or two maybe. And so at that time, what's versus with the mostest? Well, we planted in there 2 months earlier. We're not going to see a big problem with the with the summer annual weeds. The more closely related these the crops and weeds are, the more likely it is that they're going to be a problem in that crop. And sometimes that's due to herbicide selectivity. If you're using the herbicides, there may be some people in here that do. And it's just one of those things that the herbicides that kill a particular weed species sometimes would also kill the crop that's closely related. So the closer that relationship is, the more likely it is that herbicide is not one that you can use. For organic folks, growth habit, visual appearance of those weeds, it's just hard to see. How many grow potatoes? Anybody? Do you have a problem with nightshade? Anybody? Hairy nightshade? Why? Same growth habit? To an extent, it grows out there, but they look almost identical. You got tomatoes out there, you get tomatoes. You get a lot of nightshade in tomatoes because you don't physically see it there. It's just the same shape of the leaf, the same color essentially, and then the next thing you know, the potatoes are dying of late blight, and then what have you got? A bunch of hairy nightshade. So you've got to think like a weed here. Think about how they're going to camouflage themselves in there. And if you've got a place that you know, again, that's a close relative where those weeds are, like you got a lot of nightshade, that's probably not the place you want to put your potatoes this next year. Maybe you want to put those potatoes somewhere else. Crop history, know what was there before. Know the crops because that'll give you an idea of what weeds will follow. So if you're growing broccoli, you're probably going to have shepherd's purse, right? It's just one of those things. So the idea is plant somewhere you know you don't have shepherd's purse or not much, and maybe you have a lot of wild oat or something else there. You can put in these other crops that are going to help you to combat those weeds. So It's important to know this kind of thing. Good competition is kind of the name of the game. We want to have that crop as healthy as possible. We want it planted correctly. We want it growing healthily. Anything you can do to get that crop up and going fast and quick and happy, that's going to be the best thing you can do for the weed management. Anybody who's just renting land or something like that, we get a lot of land trading up where we're at. So we have to be ever mindful of carryover issues. So if you're getting new land, and make sure you know what the cropping history was, and make sure you know if any of these herbicides that could potentially carry over are carrying over. Some of these, particularly if you've got alkaline soil conditions, this Atrex or atrazine may last in the soil for 2-3 years. Some of these other ones that long. So just be aware that if you're adding new sites, be aware what that crop history is, particularly aware what the herbicide is during that transition time. How many have tried these kind of products, these pre-plant incorporated or pre-emergence stuff? These organic amendments is kind of what I call them, because the corn gluten meals, the wheat gluten, I can't get the stuff to work, frankly. I've tried, I started looking at this back in the turn of the century, and it wasn't that long ago, was it? We had problems, I just can't get the stuff to go very well. And I put on plenty of corn gluten meal, and we're talking 2,500 pounds per acre. And it's 10% nitrogen. Ooh, yeah. That's a lot of N. I can't kill the weeds. I get the most 10% weed control. Wheat gluten, about the only thing I saw with wheat gluten, I will tell you, with wheat gluten, I put that stuff out there. It's supposed to control the seedlings. You get the irrigation on it. It forms this hard crust, this really nice crust. Doesn't control weeds, but it tastes pretty good. The mustard seed meal. Now, mustard seed meal, I think Lori mentioned this one. Mustard seed meal is the one thing out there that I've actually seen some good results with. It's almost too hot. As far as using it as a product in your vegetable production. I think where it's going to fit best is in her work that she was doing with the orchards. Orchard crops do have a good place for that. I will tell you that in berry crops we can also use it to some advantage. I will also tell you that the rate we're putting on is about a ton per acre, and until such time as we are going to start squeezing a lot more of this mustard seed, I don't know it's going to be available. And if we get a ton of, if we could maybe get a ton per acre of the dry meal produced, that means we could actually treat a ton on an acre of somewhere else. Unless we're growing a whole lot of this, the price is going to be very high. So unless you're in container nursery or unless you're in a very high value crop, probably this is not one that's going to really fit for you. Now things can change, you know how that goes. Or you could grow your own, right? Grow a nice field of mustard, squeeze out the biofuel for it, and then you've got that dry mustard ready for whatever use you want to do. I've got distiller's grain on here. I don't know, you guys doing any alcohol production here? Well, no, yeah, okay. I mean in the fuel side of things, not the other. Well, I'll just move on. We did a little a trial out, actually looking at some of these. I've done a couple of trials. This is one I wanted to kind of show you with potatoes. Because we wanted to look at corn gluten meal, we wanted to look at distiller's grain in particular, but we also had some mustard meal out there. Not just mustard seed meal, but also canola meal, because we've heard that sometimes that gets some weed control. It's interesting that we didn't see a lot of results the first year. Didn't have a lot of weeds. It chose exactly the wrong spot. We actually planted pretty late that year. And again, late season winter annuals, how many new seeds did we get germinate? Not as many. So we didn't have a lot of weeds germinate that year. So I thought, well, we better redo this just to make sure. And so the second year I took the corn gluten meal out and just put in the mustard seed meal, the wheat gluten, and distiller's grain. And I was able to finally see some damage on potatoes from mustard seed meal. Kind of a yellowing, chlorotic effect on the leaves, so we did see a response, but it was up at 2 tons per acre, so that's a pretty high rate. Other than that, we have not seen that be a problem, and the weed control was actually pretty good. We didn't see even at that rate, the plants recovered pretty well, and so we didn't see any issues with it. So even with potatoes, I think there may be some potential for use of the mustard seed meal as well. Let's see, there I am. How many of you use these products? The vinegars, yes? Lots of vinegar? Acetic acid, the pelargonic acid I've got on the list. I don't know that we're going to get an organic certification with that, although I understand that there is a company that's thinking about going that direction. The current Scythe product doesn't do the trick. It's going to be non-organic certified, so it's strictly for conventional, or at least not in the production side of things. The clove cinnamon oil, have you played with that? Yeah. I've not had good results with that. I did test some pine oil from Australia, New Zealand. They've got some product available there. They were kind of looking to maybe get into the North American market. It's performed pretty much the same as the clove did. Limonene is kind of a new thing now. It's coming from orange peels left over from that, and they can extract the limonene, and it's a pretty hot product as well. This lemongrass oil specifically from lemongrass. So we do get some of these products. They all basically act the same way. They're all contact herbicides. The idea is you spray it out on the plant, burns off the cuticle, allows the seeds kind of to, or excuse seeds, allows the cells in the leaf to desiccate. So you got to have warm conditions. You got to apply it early in the life cycle, early as in cotyledon stage 1, 2, 3 leaves. Get past there, it's going to be kind of tough to get it to go. One thing I'll say on the vinegar too, we kind of need about 20% acetic acid in order to get a good control. Now, some of these other mixes that are looking at the limonene plus citric acid plus some other things, they're a little bit lower in concentration in the acetic acid. Some of the non-food ones they're saying they've got acetic acid listed as an inert to get around the labeling thing. So you got to kind of have to watch that. Make sure that the product that you're going to use is one that you can use for organic certification processes. There are vinegars that have gone through the process for food use that you can use in organic production. Otherwise, they are there as non-crop areas only. And so just be aware that that's a factor you need to keep in mind. I want to show you just a real quick thing. Keep in mind on the vinegars and all these actually, you've got to apply them more than once for the most part, even on seedling weeds, because the new seeds will come up, they're not going to be controlled, or there'll be recovery or something like that. What I'm showing you here, there's basically 3 sets of bars, right? On the far left side, those blue bars is a product called Weed Farm. I don't know if you have that here. It's a 20% acetic acid. It's pretty good stuff, actually. What you see here on the 2 bars, you've got a light blue and you got a dark blue, light blue, dark blue. Those are applied one time or applied twice. So the first one is 4 days after the first application. The second bar, the darker bar, is 8 days after the second application. So 4 days after the first application, 8 days after the second application. Notice with the vinegar, we really didn't see much difference. We got very good weed control with just one application that year, but the second one we did get a little increase. So about 2 weeks after that first one, we were able to see about 90% weed control. Did a very good job for us. This was in May time frame. So for us, May means this, if it's not raining, it will be soon. Cool weather, and it actually did quite well. Check out what we got with the Matran. This is a clove oil product, and we were applying that at 15%, which is a very, very high rate. You know, we didn't get above, 40% control with any of those. The interceptor is the pine oil. Did a little bit better, but notice the big difference between the first application and the second. With pine oil, definitely we had to put out 2 applications in order to get some kind of weed control. So it was real important with that one. The 3 bars in each cluster, the first one is used alone. The second one is with a surfactant. Humusol is what they were saying to use with the Matran product, so we tried it there. And the yucca extract is what they suggested we use with the vinegar. So these are surfactants, get the herbicide to spread out on the leaf cuticle, maybe get better burn. You can see that for the most part, it really didn't make a lot of difference for us. And that's kind of the same way with herbicides, with surfactants. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But for this purposes, the big thing is vinegar actually works the best, at least on these side-by-side. In this particular year on the species we were dealing with. How about Canada thistle? Can you kill Canada thistle with vinegar? Sure. You drop the bucket on it and maybe it'll do the trick. You know, it's I sprayed them 4 times in May then we hand weeded, then we harvested our raspberries, and then I sprayed them one more time just for fun. And what you see here, the initial burn is after 2 applications. This is amount of Canada thistle control. Bigger the bar, the more control we got. Pine oil, so-so, and vinegar did actually pretty good. Look at that season long over on the side. That's the one that I kind of want to get your attention to. See how high that amount of control we got there? That's for 5 applications and a hand weed control. So by the end of the season, we were sitting about 60% weed control with the vinegar product. How did we do with clove oil or pine oil? 30%. That's after 5 applications. I don't even want to think how much that cost. I mean, that's an expensive treatment at 15%. So, I guess what I can tell you is don't expect to get perennial weed control from these products. If you're using these products, expect to get annual weed control, but don't expect it to be cheap. Bottom line on these, pre-PI products can be active on seedling weeds, definitely. Mustard seed meal in particular. Does a very good job for us. You got to keep that in mind. If you ever get a chance to get mustard bran, actually, this leftover from they remove the seed coat before they make French's mustard, things like that. That seed coat also has that same property. It has the glucosinolates in there, and it does act as a kind of a fumigant. So if you can get a hold of that type of product, then that will be a good product to use, I think. Post-emergent products. Earlier is better. Get them in the cotyledon stage, just like you're doing for mechanical weed control. Try to do that. Warm, dry days is what you really want to have. I don't know if that's a problem in Utah. Warm, dry, probably can cover that. Repeat applications as necessary, though. So expect to have to do that. If you're happily surprised, and maybe you're going to be happy at the end of the season too. Keep in mind, too, that these are directed applications. If you've got anything that's nearby there, you're going to have some problems with it. I do want to leave some time. How much time I got now? What time I get done?
You got 10 minutes yet.
Okay, let me kind of go through one more thing, because I want to talk a little bit about this stale seedbed stuff. How many are using this kind of concept right now? Probably many of you. A few of you are, anyway. Well, the idea with the stale seedbed, this is from that P trial, so you can see what kind of, that's 8,000 seeds per square meter, by the way. So that's common lamb's quarter for the most part. A lot of common lamb's quarter. The idea with stale seedbed is you make your seedbed, allow those seeds to germinate, because those weeds are going to pop up quickly, right? We're going to burn them off or kill them with shallow tillage. We could use a herbicide like acetic acid. We could use flame. Any of these things just to get rid of those, but not to stir the soil and bring up new seeds. One of the techniques we kind of were playing around with was to use this one, where we prepare the seedbed first, but then we just leave it. We don't plant anything into it, and we allow the things to work out that way. We flamed off, and the flaming did a very good job for us, as propane flame, did a very good job of killing that stuff off. And then we put the transplanter out, put the broccoli out as a transplant. That gave us very good in-row weed control. It really did. We were getting probably 70% weed control initially anyway with the transplants. You have a little bit of transplant shock, so it takes a while for that broccoli to get going, or whatever you're transplanting. But you're still miles ahead of what you would have been coming from seed, particularly with a crop like broccoli that can be very quick out of the ground. The thing that's going to work for us here is that the weeds, you got to give them time to germinate. That may be 7 days, that may be 10 days. Give them time to germinate, to get them up and going, and then you can kill them off. If even a day before that you flame it and then it germinates, it's not going to be controlled by that. So you have to give it enough time to get most of those seeds up, get those weeds up. And this one's best used if you're using a crop that transplants, and broccoli certainly does transplant well. Kind of a second little thing that we can do is if we got a crop that takes a long time to germinate or to come up, like a potato, for instance, putting that seed piece in there, we can get 3 weeks sometimes before we see the first leaves start to come up, right? So in that kind of sense, you can put the crop in the ground, and just before you see emergence, in fact, you can kind of just see the potato plants sticking up here where the arrow is. Where is it? Over here. Just barely sticking out of the ground. Flame those guys off. See what size those smartweed seeds are. They're about, or seedlings, they're about 3 seeds or 3 leaves. we were able to kill those off very nicely with propane flame. Did a fantastic job. This alone, we got 60% weed control in that potato row. And after that, we really didn't have to do a lot of seed because these potatoes grow so fast. We got row closure in the row very quickly. We just didn't have weeds in the row after that. So it's an excellent, excellent way to kind of use on this. You could also use it on slow germinating annuals or biennials like carrots. So if you're growing carrots, they take a long time to germinate, right? And that's part of the problem, is that you're germinating after the seeds are up, the weed seeds are up. So these kind of work for this pre-emergence. You put the seed in the ground, let the seeds germinate, and just before the carrots start coming out of the ground, that's when you flame them off. Or use vinegar, or use one of those other products. This is a trial we had. We had 3-year rotation. We were looking at various vegetables. We had broccoli, we had potatoes, we had cucumbers, and we had spinach. Each year we kept the same plot, and we had a bunch of different treatments. We were looking at clove oil, we were looking at some of this stuff, and I'll tell you that clove oil didn't do the trick for us. Vinegar didn't do the trick. Flame did the trick. So these are averaged across all the different vegetables. And you can see here, look at the bottom line. It says weedy, and that tells you how many weeds were present in grams, dry weight of grams there at this midpoint of the season. All these other ones, you see the letters on there, the A, B, C, Ds. If they have the same letter, statistically they're the same. So anywhere that has an A on there is identical statistically to not doing anything. All right, so that first season, look what happened when we had the early flame out there. Statistically, we reduced the amount of weeds that were there mid-season. Even if we didn't do any early flame and we're just using those other herbicides, we were able to reduce that. But year 2, year 3, when we had, again, poor weed control, what happened? We got a lot of seed rain, we got a lot of new seedlings, and what happened with that early flame? We're still getting good early flame, but the problem is that if we didn't do early flame, it's just like not doing anything at all. Check out the hand weed, though. Hey, hand weeding works. Big surprise. Well, I'm going to, one more thing I want to show you. This is hand weeding with strawberries. Anybody grow strawberries? Okay, what we had done, we flamed over either before transplanting, right before transplanting bare root, or right after transplanting. And then we had either 1 or 2 flamings. It's the same kind of deal here, except that we were tracking how long it took us to do hand weeding. 6 hand weedings over the course of the year. This is number of hours per, I think, acre. Hours per acre. 300 hours per acre. Excellent. Flaming, we were able to see reduced amount of time spent weeding. And it was pretty sizable that first year. We were down by about 1/3. 1/3 less time weeding if we did a flame right around that time of transplanting. I thought it was interesting. We could transplant and then flame either way, or flame first and then transplant. We were doing it by hand. And frankly, it didn't matter. That seedling, that young bare root strawberry, didn't mind it either way, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. So I want to leave some time for some questions. So if you got some questions, let's try to ask me one that I can answer. Yes?
What was the effect of the water quality on vinegar treatments?
Water quality on vinegar. I've not heard that that's a big issue. Sometimes with herbicides it is, but I've not heard that with vinegar.
Well, we just got a lot of calcium in the waters around here sometimes. So.
Well, keep in mind though, with most vinegar products you're using them full strength. Most of them don't have a dilution into it. So when you're buying a gallon of that Weed Farm, for instance, you're applying a gallon of Weed Farm. Clove oil, the pine oil, if we ever get a registration for it, pelargonic acid, that is a blend in water. So you're taking 5%, 10%, 15%, mixing it with 85% water. With the vinegar products, you're buying a particular percentage of acetic acid or whatever it is. So you're using it full strength.
It's a ready-to-use product.
Yeah, it's full strength product is what you're applying. Now you can vary maybe how much you're putting out gallonage-wise. Maybe you'll just put 20 gallons per acre versus 80 gallons an acre. If you like the result, that's what you can play around with. Most of these things are going to cost at least $20 a gallon, though, and so you have to kind of do the math there and determine how high value is it worth and how much time is it going to save you. Oh, I'm glad you asked that. What kind of flamer did I use? Most of the time we used an open flame as a pre-emergence kind of flamer. So on the potatoes and things like that, we just used an open flame. We had a backpack kind of unit because it works well for plots. But you could use a Red Dragon or anything else that's just burning open flame propane. Next to the row, we were also using a high efficiency unit. This is out of Switzerland. It's kind of one of these that burns the propane, but you're really just generating heat. And so underneath that little unit, it gets up to 1,200 degrees Celsius, and so you can go fairly quickly. But one thing we noticed, that the bigger the weeds, the poorer that one really did perform. We had to go way slow, and so if you have a lot of ground to cover, you've got to pretty much use that open flame. We were only going half a mile an hour, and sometimes that was too fast. It's gonna be almost complete combustion, so you can just determine that whatever you're using out of that propane is going directly into carbon dioxide, so whatever that rate is. So it is going to do that. Yeah, but any other one you're going to use too. I guess you could use, if you want to have a natural gas generation from manure or something like that. And we do have some of those plants that we have now on the big dairies. I don't know if you guys do, probably as well. There may be some potential to grab that natural gas, and then you'd have a zero-sum game. Yes? For us, clear plastic, the weeds say, thank you, it's warm. And they grow like crazy. Here, I think clear plastic is probably the way to go if you want to get that solarization effect, or if you want to get it so hot on the surface of the soil that you're going to get that control. Black plastic works best for us because it excludes the light. And if you don't have the light there, you're not going to get the seeds germinating in the first place.
My thought was
I don't know that it would increase the temperature anymore. I don't know if you've looked at that. Well, for us, that's August, Dan. Yeah. Now, they do have some other types of materials that they make. I don't think any of them are strictly for organic, that you could probably use them as long as you got all the materials out again. That's more of a layered product, and so it does have these different colors of layers in there, and some of them do allow a little bit of light through that enhances the germination, but it's not enough light for that weed to actually grow. Under those conditions, those kind of weed fabrics actually do quite well. Yeah, I don't know either, unless the glue or something might kick it out. There's problems with newspaper, that the ink that is used has to be the right ink. Right now we're doing a lot of work. Carol Miles at Washington State University is looking at, with Debbie Inglis, got a big grant from Specialty Crops, USDA, and they're evaluating new plastics that are truly biodegradable plastics. Right now, we don't have any plastics that can be left in the field, and the problem is that they start to decompose, and then you get all the pieces out there, and that's the problem. If you have a full black plastic, as long as you get them out of the field, you're good to go, you can use them. Paper just doesn't seem to last long enough for us, but paper can be used. There's some waxed soybean oil type papers, things like that. Last a little bit longer, but wind and rain, they don't last full season is our biggest problem.
One last question.
One last. No, I think what you just said is correct. With herbicide-resistant weeds, they get the benefit if the herbicide is used. If the herbicide is not used, they're just like any other one. They're no more able to compete in the absence of that herbicide than they were before the herbicide was ever invented. Consequently, if you're using another method, and that's kind of what these conventional guys are in Roundup Ready, where they've got all the Roundup Ready weeds now, to try to get rid of them, they're using cultivation or a different mode of action. And if you're using cultivation or using mulching, some other type of physical weed control, then that is a perfect way to get rid of that weed. And it's probably how we're all going to go back to that kind of thing and use that cold steel in the field a lot more than we used to. I will tell you, too, I did look up that question on the pollen. There is a memo out on that in 2011, actually, dated in 2011, that if the pollen is present, if you've done everything you can to kind of isolate yourself from GMO production, so if somebody down the road is growing Roundup Ready corn or something like that, as long as you've done everything you can to kind of isolate yourself and you can document that, that is good enough for organic certification. Even if they come in and they test and they find the Roundup gene there, you can show them in your crop and plan that you've talked about that, and you've talked to your neighbors, and they know that you're there. That's all you can reasonably do. Now, if you're into seed production, it's a different story. If that pollen is actually pollinates the seed that you're trying to grow to sell as seed, that's a huge issue. And then I don't think there's anything you can do to get around that, and that's when the lawsuits happen. But for just incidental type of pollen blowing, you should be good to go.